the priority is allowing BRC20 assets to live on. And I think the programmable module and then the single step transfer we've been toying with allows BRC20 to plug into these other systems much more easily. And hopefully that slowly starts to remove that maxiness, which I think is utterly redacted.
I'm really excited that you're here. I think you just mentioned to me off camera that this is the first video interview that you've ever done in the space. I take that as a deep honor that you're willing to be here and that you trust me to hold this conversation. I think I want to take this opportunity, and obviously tell me how you feel about that, but I think I want to take this opportunity to share a little bit of your story with folks who may not have had, kind of the opportunity to really get to know you in this sort of intimate setting. I know that your background prior to Ordinals and BRC20 was not so Bitcoin focused. Is that accurate? I mean, what were you doing before Ordinals?
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me. Let's see how it goes.
Yeah.
Sure, it'll be great. But yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, I certainly wasn't putting most of my focus on Bitcoin as close as 2 years ago. I think the Ordinals protocol, like many others, is what brought us back to Bitcoin. And in the past, I just hodled it in my ledger, but really not done anything. I started quite late, 2019.
That's when you got into like crypto broadly, was 2019?
Yeah, made all the mistakes you could. Like, my information sources were Reddit and YouTube, which are like the bottom of the barrel, but slowly understood more. And I was working in data science at the time. And I think the breakthrough was in the summer of 2020. I found Ethereum DeFi, specifically things like Uniswap, Aave, et cetera, et cetera. And I just, graduated from school. I was looking to build a data science portfolio. And I was like, here is some amazingly clean data that I don't need to spend hours wrangling. I can just do analysis. On top of it, even better, I can maybe make some money off it. So, the first thing I was doing was scraping Ethereum to look at Uniswap traders. And then I built a Telegram bot to like trace these traders, the most profitable ones over time, really in the depths of a DeFi summer. So I got really comfortable with Ethereum data there. Moving forward, I kind of participated in, I was putting my entire paycheck into Bitcoin and Ethereum every month. But was really still kind of broke. I was like a college or just graduated. I had student debt. And then I think my real breakthrough in terms of getting crypto native was finding Twitter, Telegram, Discord. And I found, some particularly useful NFT Discords that basically were my lucky break in Ethereum, maybe January, February 2021. And then I utilized that on-chain data skill set that I had to kind of elevate that alpha I had access to through these groups. So did exceptionally well in 2021. Had a great time. It was probably the craziest part of crypto I've experienced, NFT summer. And then afterwards, I was looking for how do I enter the industry more full time, and actually met one of these guys. I didn't know his name. He was just like a cat PFP on Discord at a NFT NYC in, I think, November 2021. Turned out he worked for a payments company in their crypto team. And joined them and led on-chain data for that team for a couple of years up until about the time I released BRC20.
So this was like a major public company that won't be named kind of thing.
Big company, yeah.
Big company, not public company, big company that won't be named. And you were sort of, I guess, just hodling through the bear between NFT summer into the launch of Ordinals, essentially, working on data analytics on chain.
Yeah, a lot of stable coins, digital commerce, NFTs, collectibles, things like that. It's my focus. Ethereum, Solana, Tron for stable coins, all of the above. And then I was really trying, at this time, I had 200 followers on Twitter. Most of them were probably bots. And I was trying to build my brand in the analytics space. I'd seen a couple of people the previous cycle that had done a really good job of that. People like Hill Dobby, many others escape my mind right now. But I was like, okay, I'm doing interesting stuff. If I'm going to do it for my own trading, I may as well published it online using Dune, which was the best platform at the time. And yeah, Ordinals came about. It clicked with me instantly. My favorite niche within Ethereum NFTs was like the fully on-chain NFTs, uh, things like Chain. So,
And CryptoPunks.
CryptoPunks isn't full. Well, they later uploaded their metadata on chain, but initially it was just a token. And
Oh,
actually,
really?
I don't know if many people in the Bitcoin community know this, but like the CryptoPunks are valued the most today. Like the one I have is actually like the version 2
Oh,
of
I didn't realize
CryptoPunks.
that. I thought that the whole reason CryptoPunks existed was because the small number of pixels could fit on chain on Ethereum.
Yeah, and they can, but that was it. That I mean, NFTs weren't around when the 721 wasn't around when they first released it. So they had to make their own standards with the marketplace, and I believe something went wrong with the marketplace that allowed people to snipe or do something to steal other people's punks. So they just redeployed a new standard where you could just claim your old punk. But the key thing here was you didn't need to burn your old punks. So there's still these V1s that are floating around. Anyways,
Oh, that's hilarious.
that's a digression. But
But you were an on-chain maxi, basically.
I'm an on-chain maxi. I like that stuff, and it's kind of like funny compared to normal NFTs on Ethereum because 721s, they have a token URI, which points to off-chain image data typically. But the token is on-chain, whereas Bitcoin is the inverse. Like the image is on-chain, but the token is imaginary. So I just thought that was like a fun polarization, and both seem to have worked, right? So I found that, I can't remember, I think I probably saw it in the first week of February, certainly, not under 1K, but definitely under 10K. Ordered, like all the, like an Intel NUC, on Amazon speed delivery to get my node up and running. Inscribed a bunch of things sub 10K.
Do you remember where you first heard of ordinals? Do you remember the moment you discovered them?
I don't, but I saw it actually in January, I think, which is quite early.
Very early.
But didn't do anything. And then I saw it again in February, and then that was kind of like the kick in the ass I needed to go ahead and, okay, this is serious. It's not just, some experimental thing that a bunch of people are just going to be playing within their basement. It was like, okay.
That was post the press release that I wrote for Casey. That was when TechCrunch started covering
there we go.
it. And yeah.
So you kicked my ass into it then.
Yeah. Well, I won't take credit for that. It was coming no matter what. But there was sort of this moment when ordinals were, getting, steam and attention just on sort of the underground, Discord, Twitter, whatever. And then there was the moment where it was okay, now this is mainstream press. And so it sounds like you got more serious after mainstream press picked it up.
Yeah. I think it's accurate. I saw the early, spam sub 10Ks, not very interesting. And then I think, the two things that play a part in BRC20s, and I don't know if we want to get there yet, but the two things that play, the early collections that play a large part in BRC20s, Foundation, or Bitcoin punks.
Because
they did this first is first. They're the inventor.
Fair launch.
Fair launch. We have no way of distributing through a smart contract.
Shout out to Robert Clark.
Shout out, yeah. And it's just, if you look at ordinals, it's based on a series of global handshakes, social consensus, etc. With ordinals case, it's we agree that these satoshis are tracked with first in, first out accounting.
So basically the concept of an indexer.
Yeah, exactly. And we agree that this particular Satoshi is tied to this piece of data. Those are the two core premises. Bitcoin punks took it a microstep further and said that okay, we also agree that we're going to have a collection layer on top of this. And it's only the first unique implementations of this SVG code or whatever it was. So I was like, okay, that's kind of cool. And people agree to that, and these accrue value. So it's another, step in that direction of social consensus. And then the next one, 2 weeks later, was Sats names, which was the real JSON daddy, I guess, bringing JSON to the masses, to the mempool, to ordinals.com. And that I think I saw on the Ordinal's homepage, which I just kind of had up on my computer while I was working, seeing what new things were coming through the mempool. And I thought that was awesome. Like, it was just like, okay, well, here's another step further, right?
New way that you can use this technology, basically.
Exactly. Like, and I think, if I'm thinking about like these aha moments, I think, with Bitcoin punks, it was like, okay, you can have this collection layer, arbitrary rules to enforce boundary conditions on, the data that's inscribed. And then I think Sats names, if I'm thinking back on it, it probably was, hey, like, this isn't just an artistic protocol. Like, this is a portal into the data availability layer that is Bitcoin, right?
Hell yeah.
So we have all this inscription tools, like, no, like, as Bitcoin, you can do wherever you want. Like, the infrastructure is in front of everyone. How about we just like do some other stuff, right? Like, I just saw, and then from that moment on, I kind of saw Ordinal's protocol as like a gateway into Bitcoin's data availability layer that's most easily accessible to majority of users, regardless of technical ability or background of Bitcoin.
Did you ideate with anyone else about BRC20 before you actually like fabricated it? I mean, was this like a conversation? Were you involved in like community discussion about this concept in advance of its execution?
No, there's two things. There's two things. Like, another part of the credit has to go to I'd been thinking like it was weird that we started with um, NFTs before we did fungibles, because in every other ecosystem it's been the other way around. I get why that was done,
It
given
makes sense.
makes sense given Casey's background.
And Satoshis are
Yeah,
are the fungibles.
the fungibles, exactly, but also um, like the limitations of Bitcoin, where you kind of like, even with BRC20 or runes, you're emulating fungibility. Like, there's still those constraints, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I understood why that like happened, but I was like, okay, surely you could do something, especially after seeing Sats names, this kind of JSON structure. And then I saw a tweet by a guy named Redphone Crypto. He works with Delphi Ventures, really smart guy. Um, putting out like a pseudo spec of like how you could go about, emulating it. Like, ultimately, I think his design like wouldn't have worked because it's missing a couple of key things, but it like kind of,
Inspired you.
yeah, it was like it was uncertainly the catalyst that made me lock myself in my room for like 2 days and build BRC20, basically.
Wow.
Because it was like, oh yeah, okay, so like other people are thinking about it, like this is an interesting way, and I like the simplicity. So like, a big part of credit has to go to Redphone. So basically, from I'll pause. Yeah.
Oh, no. Go ahead. Credit to Redphone for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, gangster.
Exactly. So from there, I like spend the next couple days, first on the data side. Like, I built the indexer, which was like the worst indexer ever and broke within like an hour once I launched it. But it was like only ever meant to be a proof of concept, like here, and to help me like verify that you can in fact do this. So
And the core download, I presume, from Redphone was we can use inscriptions as basically like a tablet for an account-based ledger. I mean, is that essentially?
no, yes, I'd say yes. I think it was just like, also like, I'd been thinking about how you could do this, and it was just really like, okay, I like to like keep it as simple as possible, get a POC out, like, it was basically just like, let's create something that actually works with an indexer. And in order to do that, like, and the idea at the time was that, like, and you read in my Git book, was like, it's meant to be as simple as possible. So I was just focusing on getting the most simple possible protocol out there in a way that worked,
And that leveraged the inscription envelope.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Because that was like the easiest thing at the time that to get into Bitcoin's data availability layer, right? And people always forget, like, I'm a data scientist. I'm a bit of a LARP dev. Like, it was like the best tool I had in my ability at that time to get data on chain. So just was practical more than anything.
So you build this thing in 48 hours.
Less, yeah.
I imagine you then go to bed.
Well, there's a bit in between, like, like, I think key thing that people didn't understand early was that anyone could inscribe anything to anyone. The two things that took me a while to think through is the levels like the layers of balances. You know, you have the availability versus the available versus the transferable balance.
Mm.
Like that was a breakthrough with the design. And the other breakthrough was like, I was like, how the hell do you prove ownership of this or intent? How do you prove intent? Because inscribing, you know, a inscription to yourself with the destination, you know, wallet in there, anyone can do, right? And I believe actually a meta protocol did this later and like realize, and they thought that they didn't realize that, you know, anyone could inscribe anything to anyone. So it was live for a couple hours and meant that anyone could steal anyone's balance. So it was just like craziness. But like that was like the two main things I think I thought through. And once I got those, I was like, okay, well, let's get a spec out. You know, initially there was 4 functions. So there was deploy, mint, transfer, and like trade or something like that.
Oh,
But ultimately, and I'm really glad I did this, I was just like, we can figure this out later. It's unnecessary complexity. And it probably wouldn't have worked given like my knowledge of the space at the time. So I think that omission was definitely a win. And like, you know, one of the biggest takeaways I've gone from this experience is like, keep it simple, stupid. And I think that was a key decision in that. Yeah.
yeah. The simplicity is sort of, I think, like absolutely key to its success. So you launched this thing, which basically, I mean, by launching it, you essentially made the first Ordi inscription ever, and then like tweeted about how this theoretically works. I mean, and you made this sort of makeshift indexer. How did people access that? I mean, what did you like put out into the world before you, I hope, crashed and passed out?
Yeah. So a couple things there. So, you know, like I deployed Ordi just as the testing apparatus. And like I did a couple transfers to prove concept, like a couple minutes to do proof of concept. I think the most interesting thing about this is that actually someone used the protocol before I released the Gitbook because they did what I've been doing with you know the Sats names and the other ones and saw it in the mempool and were like, oh, I'm going to try this out, not knowing anything about the spec rules, whatever. So
Wow.
someone deployed another token before I even released
The
the
spec.
the spec. Yeah, exactly.
It's incredible.
I thought my indexer was wrong. I was like, where's this coming from? Like, who's doing that? So that was a funny thing. So as soon as I saw that, I was like, okay, I probably need to get a spec out quickly. So, you know, this is pre-AI. So I was just like typing away like some bullshit and like, you know,
and tweeted it.
Tweeted it. Yeah. And at the time, like, I think I'd grown that 200 followers to maybe like 500 followers. And they were pretty targeted within the Bitcoin ecosystem because I'd released two dashboards that got traction previously. One was the Ordinals market tracker, and then the other was like a tracker for Sats names. So like a some sort of like crude indexer for Sats names. Yeah.
So what happens basically after this tweet goes out and this is starting to get picked up? I mean, what were the next, I don't know, 48 hours to a week like for you?
Yeah, I mean, crazy. Like within an hour, Jack Lou from OrdSwap messaged me saying, this doesn't work. It's completely broken. Like whatever. Like he had his engineers on
Failed experiment.
Like, oh, you oversaw this, etc. So I really didn't sleep that well that night.
Because you thought I botched it.
I botched it, whatever. But actually, it was Jack that botched it. He's a good friend of mine, so I can say that. But yeah, like it, I didn't sleep well. It minted out. It didn't mint out by the time I woke up, but it was like, for those times, it was affecting the mempool, which was like quite rare, like,
Ordi specifically.
And like some people had deployed some other ones as testing around by then.
It took what, maybe 48 hours for Ordi to mint out?
I can't remember, but no, I think even less than that, to be honest. I think like, maybe less than 24 for sure.
And were people using your indexer or were people like spreadsheeting away? Like how were people functionally trading? How were people minting Ordi initially?
They were using inscription tools or the Ord client itself. And I don't know who, but someone had made up an indexer. I can't remember his name, but shout out to whoever it was. But they made an indexer that basically, like, it didn't tell anyone their balances, but tracked the instances of Ordi. So you could like and I think
Within 72 hours of this experiment.
within 16 hours or something. So you could see if it had been minted out, which was the key thing. So people wouldn't be wasting, fees or anything like that.
How did everyone learn about this so fast? I mean, was like Twitter blowing up? Like, how did the memo get out so fast that people were literally building tooling for this thing within 16 hours of you sending a tweet to 500 people?
I think a couple things. I think, like this previous dashboard had gotten like the core ordinals community interested. So like they saw it and it was like something new, and like these SATs names were popping off the week prior. So it was like, oh, there's something new, let's try it. I think also like the infra providers realized like how much of a cash cow like these inscription tools were. So the first to implement like an easy, mass inscriber like was like an easy win for like, even if it was going to be a fleeting narrative. So I think both from a user perspective and an infra perspective, like it was right time, right place, which is like true for much of the BRC20 story, in my opinion.
When did these start trading on secondary? Like so they minted out. I mean, like how quickly were people like trading up these assets, Ordi specifically?
I never really followed the OTC side of things, but apparently people were, had spreadsheets, like shout out the old Ordinals days.
Asher is a good example of that. I mean, Asher made, one of the first, probably biggest OTC trades of that time period to UTXO management, hence Unbroken Chain being formed.
Yeah, so that kind of like, was going on in the background. This is
people just sending each other inscriptions of people just sending each other Ordi for OTC for Bitcoin.
And like this went on into like, I would say I released on March 9th or like 10th, so coming up on like the 2-year anniversary. And this must have like kind of this OTC dealings kind of went through to like the end of March. There's still a lot of uncertainty because like a proper, indexer product is not available yet. So there's still people saying it's broken, et cetera, et cetera. So
it wasn't easy to use at this point.
It wasn't easy to use. Exactly. So there was three main catalysts, some more than others. So we did the people were doing the OTC stuff. The Unisat indexer came out, I can't remember when, maybe like early April,
I was going to ask you how Unisat got involved. The indexer was not the first product that they built that ultimately touched BRC20. What was Unisat's first engagement with BRC20?
They were an inscription tool.
Okay. This is the inscription tooling that you were sort of referencing before.
Yeah, exactly. They were one of the
did they build?
They built like an inscription tool that allowed users, like, I think, when there was 1 hour left of Ordi mint, like you could easily inscribe through the tool because it happened so quickly. So they're the fastest to pivot and make like a specific minter for Ordi, I believe, and then later other assets. But yeah, I can't remember how we got in touch afterwards. But maybe I DM them, maybe they DM me, but
pretty quickly. I mean, it was within
pretty quickly, and
like a week. You were talking to Unisat.
You have to realize, like, I was being DM'd by like so many people, so many clear scammers, so many clear people, like, oh, you should take Ordi and like deploy it into a liquidity pool in Ethereum and rug everyone, like this kind of stuff, like it was. So I was really kind of apprehensive about everything that was coming my way. I think what, appealed to me with them is like they had already built this tool. It was battle tested. Like you could clearly tell that they had like a solid engineering team behind them. And if you did research, they came from the BSV land. So, which is where most of the early builders and ordinals came from. So, really that phase in the story, I don't really have a good timing.
It's like a blur
frame. Yeah. But, the implementation of the indexer, I think, stirred a second wave of OTC because instead of like blind trust within this, you could actually like validate, if the middleman had actually received it, and et cetera, et cetera. So,
and they built this on their own volition. Like this wasn't something that you guys collaborated on. They just built an indexer. They were like, we want to support this ecosystem.
Like I was just like so tired. Yeah, I was just like, yeah, this needs to happen, and I'm willing to support anyone that does it. And they were, the most on board and competent team at the time. And I believe that Best in Slot was not far behind. So, Best in Slot has also been around since the early days, as well as a variety of other teams, which I appreciate their assistance in the early days.
They came on later. I mean, Unisat was sort of like their day one. I mean, Benari has said to me, on camera, he didn't take BRC20 seriously initially, right? So they just sort of started a little bit later, it sounds
Yeah.
like. But Unisat was sort of, I mean, they were immediately, their inscription tooling was being used for the mint of Ordi
Mm.
specifically. I think it was who told me he was, yeah, mass, you know, like clicking away at like the Unisat tooling, playing around with Ordi while it was minting.
Then, and I just wanted to touch on like those two catalysts or three catalysts, one that's not really talked about a whole lot, and another case of right time, right place is, we just come out of the depths of like the most horrific bear market with FTX. There really wasn't that much stuff going on. Memes were really nowhere near where they're recognized today in terms of like adoption, whatever. But Pepe on Ethereum came out like that first week of April, if I'm thinking right.
Hmm.
So it was like, and that was like an implicit catalyst of like, okay, there's new things on these chains again that we can be excited about. Like it's not just depression in addition to ordinals. And I think that kind of got a lot of people from the fungible side back interested. And that was between the indexer and then the release of Unisat's marketplace, which in my opinion was like the final catalyst, which is made it tradable by PSBTs and lots, similar to how you would trade ordinals.
Was the advent of BRC20 sort of like the final kick in the pants for Unisat to get the marketplace up? I mean, were they planning on building a marketplace
Oh.
before BRC20? That was.
Well, actually, you'd have to ask them. You should get Lorenzo on the show. But,
I will. It helped.
Yeah, I'm sure it helped.
Yeah. Okay, so we have sort of this like frenzy. It's hard to track price basically because everything's happening OTC. I'm sure there were like people trading at different prices. You know, there was price was sort of like an impossible thing to track. At what point did you feel like you could start to get like real good pricing data? Was it not until the marketplace was created, until Unisat was created?
Yeah, I think probably that was like, first time I started really paying attention because like these OTC things are like often very like, who do you trust?
Unreliable.
Yeah.
Yeah. When about do you think Unisat put out the marketplace?
Like,
I don't remember.
For some reason I've got like 420 in my mind, or like late April, definitely like, or going into May.
Do you remember like watching the price action of Ordi around that time? I mean, what was going on with price
Yeah,
action?
I mean, it was stressful. Like, I mean, like we built an indexer, but like there was still like a lot of loud voices on Twitter saying, no, this is wrong. No, that's wrong. Like, et cetera, et cetera.
Technically or like,
well, both philosophically and technically, right?
yeah. I mean, I remember the philosophical conversations for
Yeah.
sure. I was working for Casey at the time.
Yeah. And actually, maybe I should get into that for a second. It's like, I knew when I was releasing it that I was an Ethereum person, had no like network within the Bitcoin community like it did in Ethereum, and frankly didn't know a whole lot about Bitcoin at the time. So I was just like, what I do know about Bitcoin is that it's like, I mean, at the time, maybe I'm a bit more negative now, but at the time, like my perception of the Bitcoin community was that, there's this ideals that Satoshi laid out. So it's like, like open access, like free and fair, these kind of things. Again, like, Bitcoin is different to everyone, but like that's kind of what I perceived at the time, being like this Ethereum person, and seeing the podcasters at the time kind of speak down to Ethereum. So I was like, okay, so what again, it's just meant to be a fun experiment, but how do I emulate the fair, free, and open philosophy of Bitcoin? And that led to like a couple of the decisions. I think, namely, this like mint function, which I think was a big contributor to its success.
Absolutely. So there were some technical considerations. You said it was mostly stressful.
Yeah.
There wasn't any part of you that was also just very excited by what was going on. I mean, do you have any memory of like how Ordi was trading in those like, let's call it like April, May, June era?
Yeah, like it was just, yeah, it was a crazy ride to be part of. I'm sure, like, anyone that was there at the time would agree.
Most of the stress around it was technical. Were you stressed out by criticisms of Ordi? By people like Casey, maybe? Philosophical criticisms. Did that
Yeah.
affect you?
Yeah, it affected me at the time because, like, there was some very loud voices talking about how this was negative and that was negative and this was negative. And I think a lot of it was valid. Like at the end of the day, like, there's certainly, I think I got a question the other day, like if you had to do BRC20 again, like what would you do differently? And I think from the core design perspective, not a whole lot because, it was a 1 in a million success story in my opinion. And tweaking any of these design variables would have likely flipped the scales in some sort of negative way. There's some few things like, like it's quite an inefficient protocol. You can do things to making like the encoding of the data better, the structure of this. But to me, like there's also some downfalls with that, right? Like we saw with the Bybit hack last week, like there's massive value to having human readable text at sometimes. So, like I get some of the points, but maybe some of the efficiency things I would have changed. And I felt a lot of the time the feedback I was getting was not feedback from a positive place. It was often feedback that, in my opinion, would have sandbagged the protocol. So change this to kill the protocol is a lot of the feedback, in my opinion, I was getting in the early days. And ultimately, I'm glad I didn't follow with a whole lot of that. Like we've had a lot of bad ideas with BRC20 in the past. I kind of like the slow approach that we've taken because I think we're finally coming up with actual ideas that improve the protocol instead of like rush things that would have been a stopgap and ultimately wouldn't have improved it in the long term.
How collaborative were you with Unisat as Unisat's marketplace was developing, right? So, I mean, Unisat basically, I mean, ultimately, I mean, it created their business. I mean, they raised many, many millions of dollars, on this marketplace, was one of the most successful early ordinals businesses by a wide margin. I mean, I remember at the time, I think may have been the most like highly valued company in all of ordinals at one point. How involved were you with Unisat and how collaborative were you with Unisat? What was your relationship with them like, let's call it like in those first 6 months?
Yeah. So I think to build the indexer, it was very collaborative. Like, hey, what do you think about this? Hey, what do you think about that? Hey, like, let's get clarification on that. As for the marketplace, like I didn't play a large part in that.
Like the rest of the business outside of the indexer, you didn't really
Yeah,
touch.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're technically an advisor?
No, I've
You have
always
no a formal business relationship with them,
yeah,
other than
neither
Almanac, which
best
we'll
in
get into.
slot. And I've always thought that it's cleaner. If you're gonna appoint maintainers to run the protocol, like if you have like financial
Like no
incentives,
money should be exchanged.
yeah, because then it's just like muddies the waters in terms of like incentives and why you're doing this. So I said, I'm sure Unisat was a great investment for people that did it, but like I'm glad in the end that that's not something I did for that simple fact alone.
Okay, so we've got like April, May, June. I don't remember. Again, I was working for Casey, so I was not paying close attention to BRC20 at this time for obvious reasons. But I presume there was sort of, a big wave in price action, OTC. You don't really know what's going on. I imagine when Unisat went live, there was also an initial, at least, big boost in price for Ordi, and that was sort of like a wave in BRC20. And then do you remember was there do you remember sort of like a first big downturn, big correction for Ordi at any point? Or was it just like up only until OKX listed?
No, it's not quite like that. It was like my recollection was that it was, these three catalysts of the indexer, like the Pepe, like on Ethereum, kind of like catalyst to the ecosystem at large or crypto ecosystem at large, and then the Unisat marketplace. And then I think OKX like was not far behind, like a couple of weeks.
Oh, it was very
Yeah, so
quickly.
hats off to them because they made it work. And I think that created like a spike in price, and then that kind of like dwindled over the summer. If I
So the
recall.
time between Unisat's launch and OKX listing Ordi was pretty short. It was like a
Yeah,
few weeks.
yeah.
Did you have any conversations with OKX? Were you involved at all in the centralized exchange listing? Did you have any idea what was coming? I mean, what was your involvement in that process, if any, or even your broad understanding of what was about to happen?
Every single marketplace listing, apart from like I think Gate, which like DM me beforehand, like was a like I woke up and it was listed and I was like, well, Like, this is crazy.
Wow. They didn't even attempt to get in touch with you and be like, hey, this is happening.
Yeah, like exactly. So that was like that's the honest point. Like, I don't know if that's something you want to claim credit for, but like I can't claim
You weren't
credit for it.
involved.
Yeah, I wasn't involved. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you have any idea how those decisions were made? I mean, in retrospect, have you been in touch with any sort of decision makers at these exchanges since? And just for context on the question, this is a big conversation that's happening in the runes ecosystem right now. There's a lot of interest and curiosity about how tokens get listed, especially when they are, kind of created by independent developers, as we know, and don't have big foundations behind them. Do you have any idea how that decision was made?
No, I don't. Like, the only thing I could maybe say that like could be some contributing factors is, 2023 was a very different time from like a listing perspective. Like I said, like there really wasn't that much going on in the early part of the year. There was like Pepe, which was like a blip, and ordinals were a thing, but you can't list those on centralized exchanges. Um, so I think it was just like the market was kind of like starved for a narrative, and it was a logical way for these exchanges to experiment. I've also heard theories that like at the time, because hindsight's 2020, but these exchanges had no idea which way these things would go. And if you look at like their business model, the vast majority of like what they held and they still hold is Bitcoin, right? And I think this could be pure projection, but like something I hypothesized at the time was that like if Bitcoin is leaving their exchange to go trade on chain on Unisat market or another market, it's leaving their liquidity bubble. So how do you solve that?
You list.
You list and then you build tooling around it. And that's what like someone like OKX did. So like that was like kind of how I kind of justified, how this
Like
happened.
it just made business sense for them to do it.
I guess. And like that's, and like
and it was the depth of the bear for Bitcoin spot, right? So, I mean, to your point, they didn't have like a lot of competition in terms of like liquidity, trading volume. Like Ordinals was the only game in town. Like
exactly. And like it seems to be much harder now just from my outside position. Like there also seems to be more emphasis on, sex listings. Like I remember last cycle, it wasn't something I really paid attention to, but now it's like in a game where people don't have much differentiation and then there's a lot of similar products. It seems to be like a differentiating factor. So it's much more competitive. There's more tokens, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, I haven't thought about it much, but like that would be like my kind of conclusion. Yeah.
So post sex listing, Ordy's like kind of going wild. It's like on a tear. We're in like Ordinal season 2, maybe a few seasons. I don't know that we've had since Casey launched it. The canonical indexer, I guess, and the reason that I'm calling it the canonical indexer is because it was the indexer that was used by OKX and later Binance. And so most of the liquidity was dependent on the indexer created by Unisat. But there were other indexers being built, one of which was by Best in Slot. Can you share a little bit about how Best in Slot got involved, what problems they were trying to solve, and how they were trying to index BRC20 differently?
Yeah, I would say there's like also around about this time into the summer, there was like one interesting thing going on, like this like Sats Mint. I've always thought it was quite cool. Like it's like 2% of like Bitcoin transactions ever or something ridiculous. And that went on throughout the summer and it was kind of like the slow burn of BRC20.
Like Sats, like the BRC20
Yeah.
Sats? Mm-hmm. Was that the second? No, there were many BRC20 tokens.
I don't know what that one was. Yeah.
But Sats was a BRC20 token that was created by the Unisat team, right?
I don't know who.
Oh, we don't know.
Yeah.
Just SATS. We have no idea if the Unisat team was involved in Sats.
It's like, it was like, I think within the first 10.
Interesting. Okay. Did Unisat have any particular BRC20 token that they take credit for? I thought that they
I think Pizza.
Oh, really?
Later on that they airdrop to people or something like that.
At one point, I thought that they had like a relationship with Sats, or they wanted to use Sats.
They
wanted to use Sats because it was a very small denomination, right? Like you could like split it up into like a million pieces, right? And so they wanted to use Sats as sort of like maybe like their fee market token or whatever.
You're right. Like they adopted it, but the nice thing with BRC20 is like it's almost irrelevant who like deploys a token. Like it's
right. Like because it's fair launch no matter what.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like the deployer has no real rights over like what happens with the token, et cetera, et cetera. Which is kind of a cool design.
I think it was one of the reasons why it was so successful, right? I mean, I remember people calling BRC20 the populist asset, right? The populist like token asset, right? It was just like fair and free for all.
Yeah, and I think that was like perfect timing as well. Like bear market, only like the most savvy people were paying attention. Yeah, I'm glad I went with this free and fair. And again, like say I'd gone down with a different approach, like something I've thought about before is like say you assign yourself like a pre-mine. I really don't think it would have gone to the highs that it did. It's like something you
Right.
think about, obviously, when these numbers go to this amount. But ultimately, I'm glad I didn't because, like, again, I think it's just like with such a fine equilibrium that if you tweaked any of those variables, it would have been a very different outcome. So,
Well, and the market had already decided, even just with, non-fungible ordinals, that, free and fair was the way to, get attention basically and create trust with users. Okay, so I'm going to come back to this question. So, how did Best in Slot get involved?
yeah, like I think I met Benari in Ordinals Singapore or whatever they call it, Ordinals Summit. I think that was in like September of 2023. So what's that, like 3-4 months afterwards? I might have met him in Miami as well. I can't exactly remember the timelines, but we had been talking for some time at this point. They indicated that they had built an indexer. Like they, know more about them. Like they had a like, strong indexing background from Ethereum.
That's their specialty.
Exactly. So it was like, hey, we're an Ordinals, infrastructure slash aggregator company. Like we'd love to like offer BRC20 and like index and whatnot. So I was like, great, like a super competent company, interested in BRC20 at the time.
What did they want to do differently with the indexer than Unisat?
Nothing.
They just wanted to build another instance of the indexer.
Yeah. Because at the time there was like this narrative where BRC20 was like centralized and like we needed this coalition of indexers and despite some other meta protocols not having that same
was some I was going to say Casey's indexer is completely fine to be centralized, but to be fair, Casey's work is always open source. Some of the concern around that was because Unisat refused to open source or didn't or wasn't at the time open sourced.
I'm in jest. Like
that's a fair
argument, and I think it was a good outcome. And like there was a number of indexers at the time, like just off the top of my head, and sorry if I forget anyone, but like the hero guys they index Allium much later. I think Ordiscan team did some indexing. And again, sorry if I forgot anyone, but like the early times, like we had a good group of indexers and we're spot checking each other's results.
How much of them were all of them open source except for Unisat, essentially?
Can't recall. Yeah.
Okay. Because you only need one open source.
Yeah. And I think, like Best in Slot probably, took that to heart the deepest, and then that transformed to OPI, which is like this client that you can run to index BRC20. But
and the idea with OPI is that it was somewhat more decentralized because anyone could run the software basically. And I mean, how would you describe the decentralization benefits as, I don't think they're like crazy, but like, how would you describe
the so the cool thing about OPI, in my opinion, other than being just like an easy to run client that like, you could run like the Ordinals client, which is great for just like getting the protocol out there, is that they had this page that you like there was a way that you could report like a hash of the results every block, the state hash, and then compare those amongst the indexers.
Make sure they match.
So it's not just one implementation of OPI, it's just that you can spot check others at any given point in time, just to make sure that everything is
an extra check on like correction, basically. Okay, so you're starting to develop a relationship with Best in Slot. And yeah, I mean, at what point, I mean, I remember, so when was there, I mean, we're talking about all these different indexers as well. I think the next sort of like key point in this story is when Casey was about to make like a major upgrade to ordinals, and that sort of threw all the indexers a little bit into a question mark about how you were going to handle upgrading all of these different indexers if, the underlying protocol of ordinals itself changes. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, that was it. And there was basically I think it was really just one key decision was, do we go ahead with X, Y, and Z, or do we stick and freeze to the current
I think it
implementation?
was ordinal. It was inscription numbers, right? Like, are we going to change the inscription numbers? Because I think that was the upgrade when Casey was
Yeah,
going to. They were going to be change. He was going to integrate all of the like the cursed inscriptions or ossify the cursed inscriptions or something,
yeah.
and numbers were going to change. And so you guys had to decide. Are we going to upgrade or are we going to stay until that's more clearly solidified? Is
Hmm.
what I remember. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I think so. And like, my default throughout all of this has been, security. Like that's been my number one priority.
You're pretty conservative with
I would
like,
say so. Yeah.
yeah.
And I think, well, I'm biased, but I think you kind of need to be in this game, right? So
Well, there's money on the line.
yeah, exactly. So that was like my default decision, like we weren't really using like these new inscription types weren't really going to improve the protocol in my opinion, and it was only going to bring risk. So that, and then moreover, it's like we had nothing to do with inscription numbers, so like the update changing like was relevant. So I think Unisat saw it in a different way, and I think that's fine. And that was the real cause of the disturbance. In hindsight, probably would have dealt with it differently, and I'm sure they would have said the same. Because I think it was just like a lack of communication that led to a boiling point. And then the fact that it was like a time ticking down to a block height didn't help either.
Yeah, it was like it became an urgent situation
Yeah.
at some
So,
point.
so I think ultimately, like, we reached a compromise.
And that's how Best in Slot ultimately got involved.
No, that was later, I think, actually. But we reached a compromise in terms of like how we proceed. Again, it's kind of escaping me now. Like its relations have been good since, I'd say. Yeah.
So this was sort of like a moment where there was, you realize you have multiple indexers. They actually do need to be in social consensus. I mean, that's sort of what it boils down to.
Yeah,
If
and
you're
we
going to have
agree.
multiple indexers,
Yeah.
they need to be in social consensus.
And in hindsight, like I'm, grateful for everyone for collaborating, because there was like back and forth, but ultimately everyone agreed that we needed to agree that any sort of fork was really not in the best interest of the community, and then found a resolution that kind of like fit everyone's needs and interests. And then everyone shipped it within 48 hours. So thankful for everyone involved, including yourself, which helped me with like a lot of the communications.
That's when we met.
Yeah.
I mean, we'd met, but that's when I sort of got deeper into this universe with you. Yeah. So Best in Slot, I mean, my understanding also is sort of after that kind of moment where you have this tension of, okay, we have multiple indexers. We all need to agree if there's going to be upgrades and how are we going to manage basically the upgrade process. After that, did you guys, I mean, I believe it was shortly thereafter that you sort of relaunched the Layer 1 Foundation as a governance organization that was sort of meant to coordinate these different actors, and multiple of the companies that had BRC20 indexers kind of joined on board and sort of kind of socially agreed to collaborate. Is that a fair
Yeah, I think
assessment?
we realized that it was a shit show, and like we should avoid doing that again. So we had Layer 1 Foundation, which was kind of like this ambiguous body that me, Alec, and Best in Slot set up. So Best in Slot had been working together for a while at this point. Like they were like an original contributor to the Layer 1 Foundation. We knew that like something like this was needed, but didn't really know how to best purpose it. And I think at the time, the best use of that body or medium was just to establish some sort of governance set or rules, or ways to abide by, so we can like approach these decisions in the future in a much more intelligent way. And that resulted in, and again, I might be skipping steps forward or back, but my recollection is that like we resulted in this like oversight committee that sat above two lead maintainers with both Unisat and Best in Slot.
At that point, they both, and to this day, still run different indexers. Is that
Yeah.
accurate? But both indexers are open source.
Yeah. Unisat, I'm not fully aware, if I'm being honest.
Okay.
But they validate like with each other.
Right.
Like,
And Best in Slots is certainly open source.
Yeah.
Okay. And they're kind of checking each other. They work together. How is the working relationship with the three of you? I have a little bit of a peek insight into this, but I'll let you share.
I kind of I'm happy with the way that it's gone. They're very different teams. Unisat is like very gung ho, innovate, build
Move
things
fast and
quickly,
break things.
move things and break things. Where I think best in slots a bit more meticulous, come from like an audit background.
Conservative.
Yeah, check things. What's that thing like? Measure 3 times and cut once. Like whatever. Yeah, so they really work from that perspective well together.
They're like a balancing act.
Exactly. So happy with the way that has turned out, and like they've like at the end of the day, like this is an open source protocol, so I'm like indebted to them for continuing to work on this, right? And I think that's the way that an open source protocol should result. Is I think that the creator, it's great and all to create something, but over time, your ideas aren't necessarily going to be the best ideas. You know, more technical, more experience, and a bigger pool of ideas and people working on the protocol is healthy. And I've liked the way that this is going. Like I've been involved, and I see myself as a bit more of a coordinator. But like all signs are very positive with the way things are going, and again, like I think it's working well. Um, and there's a world in the future where Domo might not be part of BRC20, and I think that would be a healthy thing. But like obviously not yet. But like I think we're moving in a more kind of healthy way towards open source and ossification.
So this team that's coming together, how, I mean, you've been working as a team on specific technical developments. You guys have been talking about two primary upgrades to the protocol in the past, maybe like 8 or 9 months. And that is the swap protocol and the the swap module and the programmability module. I don't know if you want to share a little bit about what those are. Obviously, I think something that's worth pointing out that I think is well known is that both of these companies, Best in Slot and Unisat, also have other businesses that they're running, right? I mean, this is kind of an independent project for everyone involved. No one is sort of like directly profiting off of this. I guess
It's a very thankless job.
it's a very thankless job. I was going to say, I guess arguably Unisat has some skin in the game with the marketplace, but this is definitely a very different, monetary opportunity than their other businesses, which they also have to run. That said, they're still contributing quite a bit to the development of BRC20. How do you see these two developments that have, now been kind of on the table for some months and that have been in the work for some months, both the swap module and the programmability module?
No, this goes back all the way to like summer 2023 as well. We realized at the time that, frankly, trading these fungible assets, like we weren't really trading them fungibly. We were approximating fungibility by selling lots of these as you would with NFTs. And any sensible protocol would strive to like improve that experience. So that's the kind of the birth of the swap module came from. Of course, we made mistakes there by using this like black and white. Like I think that was a mistake module technique, but like proven that like this is a viable technology, and then it's been later proven via Unisat's fractal network that this is like battle tested and a good experience. And hopefully there, just the idea is like improves the trading experience, resembles fungibility a bit more. And then it also like with these sequencers, like you can, improve the UX and experience to hopefully resemble even closer to, broader crypto experiences like a Uniswap on Ethereum or like Jupiter on Solana.
How did their original swap implementation work? And like, what was this sort of, I mean, they were attempting swaps very early on right now, and I'm not entirely sure I understand like the tech behind it or how it worked, but I'm curious if you could give like a little context on that.
Yeah, it's not a whole lot different to
Okay.
what it is now, in my opinion. Like they've had some years to like improve it, but the crux of the idea is the same. Just like a sequencer driven swap module. Um, and the nice thing there is like people talk about it as the Unisat swap. Sure, they're building it, but again, like anything with BRC20, like it doesn't like it's not going to be specific to Unisat, right? Like any team can deploy a swap module and adopt a token into that.
And they offered this on the marketplace. I mean, this was a live offering at one point.
Yeah. Like using this black and white swap module, which, yeah, again, I think was a bad idea.
There were some challenges.
Basically, because it's just like there's no, with any of these meta protocols, is the route to upgrade something is a long one. And, having this system where like it takes liquidity without a clear path forward was ultimately, in my opinion, a mistake. But it's something that like we're
Working on.
been working on. And like, it's like, that's likely the closest to next update.
That's sort of like the priority update at
Yeah.
this point. And then the programmability module that ideated, like how did that idea come into play? I mean, was this something that Benari and you were talking about pretty quickly after they became lead maintainers or even maybe before?
Yeah. I remember we were speaking about it, or he brought it up in Taiwan in 2023 at, uh, I forget the name of that one. But it was like a Bitcoin summit, and we were talking about there. And ultimately, it was like with my background before, came from Ethereum, so I think you can hate on Ethereum all you like, but the EVM is a completely battle tested and well adopted, and well suited to the BRC20 design. Just like if you forget the name even for a second, so I think it made a lot of sense if they could work through, the edge cases of creating an adapter into Bitcoin, using UTXOs to bind data to Bitcoin, et cetera, et cetera. If you could work through those, it made a lot of sense in my opinion. And, like I think that was quite forward thinking at the time because, we were only starting to work with meta protocols, let alone programmable meta protocols.
No one was talking about it. I mean, I remember when I probably first heard Benari talk about the concept of like introducing an EVM at the indexing layer, maybe in like April or June or something of last year. I had never heard of that before. Now it's a thing. Now you're hearing many teams working on, programmable meta protocols as I generally refer to them. But it was a breakthrough at the time.
Yeah. And I think, I've thought a lot about like how this, state ends up is like the current meta protocol state is I think ultimately a programmable meta protocol will win. We're 2 years on and we're still, trading these things with like lots, like NFTs. Like I think you're a Solana, like degen, you're coming over to Bitcoin, it's 10 minutes, you're trading these like NFTs. It's like, okay, cool. I'm going to go back to Solana. I think we have to adapt and there's a lot of cool things that we can do. That's why I'm excited about the programmable module. But ultimately, like my focus has always been on the underlying assets on the BRC20 protocol. Is why I think that the standard maxiness is just so redacted. Like it's so like unnecessary. It absolutely hurts the industry at large or our niche at large.
Do you think the lack of interoperability is what's driving standard maxiness?
Could be.
I mean,
Like I
that's sort
think
of
there's a couple
my,
things driving it.
yeah. Okay.
But like the lack of that interoperability certainly is a contributing factor. Like if you think about Ethereum, it's natively composable, interoperable with these assets. So if you like, and this is like how dumb it sounds, right? Like on Ethereum, like someone being like a 721 maxi over a 115 maxi, you're like what? Like
Makes
what are
no
you
sense.
talking about, right?
Yeah, no,
Like
this is a key point.
if you are like don't like wherever, like you think 721's the devil and you think 115's like Jesus, like you can like wrap that into that format, right? Like you can just do that natively with
They're
the thing.
interoperable, so it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
But lack of interoperability, I think, is what is, I mean, in my opinion, is what's driving this sort of standard maximalism, right?
Sure. And
Because
there's some other things driving it too, but like
tell me.
I think it's obvious. But
Okay.
I think I really don't know like why people are dying on this hill, right? Like I think if you truly believe in the asset that you are surrounding, like it's in the best interest for everything to be interoperable, right? Like one layer, like lack of friction, like fractionalization, um, yeah, like focus on the asset, not the standard. So like that's the way I've always thought through things, and that's like another reason why I'm excited about programmable module. Like you never know how these things are going to go. Like maybe there's a new standard that comes out tomorrow and it's the best thing since sliced bread. Maybe there's like a dominant L2 that like is like some crazy gravitational pull of bringing in Bitcoin native assets and it's a better experience because you're not limited to Bitcoin or whatever. Maybe, maybe even it's runes that wins, right? Like ultimately to me, the priority is allowing BRC20 assets to live on. And I think the programmable module and then if you have time, like the single step transfer we've been toying with allows BRC20 to plug into these other systems much more easily, and propagates that. So you're not necessarily like dying on the hill of BRC20 as the standard. Like you have this ability to plug in that native composability, and hopefully that slowly starts to kind of remove that maxiness, which I think is, again, just utterly redacted.
I mean, so would you say it's fair to say, like, your point of view, you're not, dying on the hill of BRC20, but like maybe you would die on the hill of Ordi, right? I mean, that's sort of the idea, right?
Well, no,
Is like let Ordi survive, or let the assets that are being created be the thing that's be supported, rather than like the standard itself. If Ordi is best served by being traded on an L2 or whatever, that would be fine.
I,
Ordi is the thing that needs to be supported, or like as an example of an
yeah,
asset.
yeah, exactly. I think it's like a mix of like naiveness and arrogance to think, like we're in year 2 of like playing around on chain with Bitcoin, that we've come out with a perfect solution. So, maybe BRC20 with the programmable like module is the best solution. Maybe it isn't, but one thing's for sure is the single step transfer and the programmable module allow us to plug into these different systems if there are better solutions in the future.
So that was going to be my next question, which is, does making these different meta protocols or these different indexers programmable sufficiently solve the interoperability problem? I mean, you can have a programmable BRC20, but it's not necessarily going to be interoperable with runes or, any of these other programmable indexers. I mean, is that a solution, or do we need layer twos? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, like I think, like, there's a variety of solutions from these like code check, meta protocol bridges that you could build this on the centralized side, to more things like, there's layer 1.5s like Arch, or there's another one. And then these layer 2s, right? Like there's a variety of solutions, but what's interesting is I think, where we are in the Bitcoin space is like people are kind of toying with like where on the trust assumptions they lie and where on like the upside they lie, right? And like I think we're figuring this out as an industry, and like where people's comfort zones lie.
Yeah,
I think
what the
that
market wants, what
what
they
the
care
market
about.
wants, right? And I think that's very different from different subsets of the market. Like if you're a massive Bitcoin whale, there's very few protocols, maybe like Babylon's like one of the few, maybe VM is like, meets those conditions satisfactorily. But like if you're a Solana degen, like
You don't care.
you don't care, you're used to centralization, like you are looking for experience and upside, right? So, I don't know how this interoperability game plays out, but I think it's like so needed, and like just to leave this like, and I think we're going to look back at this period as like some like dark ages of like this like toxicity that's like wholly ultimately like slowing down the industry at large.
So it sounds like I was going to ask you. It's funny, on my like list of questions, I did have this question: do you think that programmable meta protocols are competitive with layer twos? It sounds like the question's kind of irrelevant, right? Like it's sort of like, okay, whatever tech needs to get built to create functionality and sort of serve different users is what's going to happen. Some users are going to care quite a bit about trust assumptions. Those people might actually like programmable meta protocols because the data is on chain. Do you have a point of view about that?
Yeah, it's like, I think there's a different profile for users for everything. Like I think, sure, the Venn diagrams will overlap, but at the end of the day, we're talking about Bitcoin here. Like I think there's enough users to go around. That's my thesis going forward. Obviously, it's a bit quiet right now, but there's very little to be optimistic about in broader crypto. But I still keep looking into Bitcoin with optimism because of the gravitational pull we have from there is no second best asset. Like it's just is an optimism, and I think that like the pettiness and bickering and whatnot, and we're seeing on the L2 side as well, is really just short-term
Ego.
thinking and ego and whatnot, and maybe that's naive from my side, but I think that we would be better off without it.
Do you think it's realistic that we would have like multiple different Bitcoin meta protocols that are interoperable with each other and everyone will kind of like, live together happily ever after? Or do you think there will be some fighting to the death? I mean, I had Leonidas on the show a couple of weeks ago, and his sort of point of view is that all meta protocols will effectively fight to the death and there will be one winner. Doesn't sound like that's your point of view.
Like,
I'm just curious,
what
like
message
sort
is
of,
that sending to builders in the space, right? uh, but I'll leave it at that. Like it's and even users, right? It's just it's zero sum. I don't think, maybe my approach is naive, but I think, you focus on the tech, you build what users and pain points are there, and then you leave it up to the market.
It sounds like users do want different meta protocols and they want them to be interoperable. They want them to all have as much liquidity as possible.
Yeah, yeah. I think
Some won't survive for other reasons, but hopefully interoperability won't be the problem. I mean, at least we're trying to solve that.
yeah,
Fair.
exactly. So yeah.
Do you think BRC20, and this will be sort of my last question on this topic, maybe we're kind of wrapping up, but do you think BRC20 in this land of, competitive meta protocols has an advantage? Do you think BRC 2.0 has an advantage over some of the other programmable meta protocols that are in development, just given, existing liquidity and all of that?
Yeah, I mean, your options like as BRC20 is do nothing. And I think the most likely scenario there is that some programmable meta protocol comes up and dominates, and BRC20 will not be able to take part in that because it's not interoperable. There's no programmability. There's no single step transfers. So what's the other option? Is you go down the programmability route. You have the chance of creating this gravitational ecosystem of yourself, and I think that would be great. But if ultimately that doesn't pay off, I'm not saying it will. You now have this interoperability angle that you can interact with other protocols, right? That you didn't have before. So I think no matter which way you look at the future of BRC20, this is a very positive way of looking at it. I think it's going to be. I'm excited for what comes next.
I appreciate that you're focused on, kind of having the most constructive attitude as possible, the most constructive attitude as possible as a builder. I think a lot of people appreciate that about you. And maybe to wrap up, I'll ask, how do you want the community to approach these problems? Like, what's your sort of core message to builders about how they can best approach these problems?
I think focus on the assets, right? Or
Don't
maybe
be a standard
don't be
maxi, be
standard.
an asset maxi. Is that a core
Yeah,
takeaway?
yeah.
I like that one.
I think I think there's a lot of people are only looking like what's right in front of their face. When I think there's a lot of interesting things coming to the Bitcoin ecosystem, and focusing on that like the hot narrative of the week is not really a good mindset to have, especially when you're on something as permanent as Bitcoin. And
Low
like
time preference.
time preference, um,
Think about 10 years ahead instead of like 2 months
or even
ahead.
in 1 year ahead. Like I
Hmm.
like I could give you an example. Like I think these BitVM bridges could potentially open up like a Cambrian explosion of like these DeFi yield opportunities. Um, like maybe I see that a little bit in like certain discussions, but like I haven't seen that at large. Like it's mainly been like uh, fights over the tech or the implementation, but not actually like what this means for like these products moving forward. And maybe I'm just not in those circles, but like that's an implementation where I like if I was a builder, I'd be running towards. Um, or like I was building like a user facing product right now. And then like the last thing I'd say, and like I think BZ had like a similar approach, is just like I feel like the space has kind of lost its way a little bit. Like thinking back to like the early days of ordinals, like it was just like a fun time to be a part of the industry. People respected each other, and there was just like an optimism in the space. Like again, maybe naively, but I'd like people to return to that.
Yeah, like we were all like on one team. It
Yeah,
was like
exactly.
the maxis and everyone else were the enemy. We weren't like PvPing on each other maybe as much as we have in this sort of recent market downtrend. I mean, I think probably that's maybe what's caused it. I mean, what do you think happened? What do you think is the reason why like our attitudes have sort of shifted into a little bit more competition with each other?
Like I mean, like market sentiment is always a contributing factor, right? Like I think that's good to do with it, but it's kind of funny that that's affecting a lot of people that are like saying that they're in it for the art.
Yeah, fair.
Or in it for like the tech or in it for that, because like some of those people seem to be the most affected by this. um I don't know. I think there's like again there's a lot to be optimistic about with like the way Bitcoin's going, and like channel that energy towards that instead of like negativity and sparring and whatever. I think that, regardless of what you think, the space will be better off.
Well, I'm going to have Benari on the show next. I mean, Benari is set to come on the show pretty soon. So it'll be interesting to get his take on sort of what the future looks like in a like truly programmable meta protocol universe, programmable BRC20. I think there's a lot of people, waiting for this to drop on testnet, which sounds like it's going to happen relatively soon.
And I'm excited. Like, there's a lot, like, we've kept it relatively close to our chest. And again, it's taken us a while, but there's good reason. I think people haven't really wrapped their heads around what's going to be possible with this. Like, you look at it at a surface.
Do you think people underestimate it?
I think so.
Do you think people underestimate the concept of programmable meta protocols, period?
Yeah. And I think there's a lot of exciting ones coming out as well. Like, it's not just, BRC20, like, friends around the space are building this, like the Alkanes guys, like the Glitter guys.
I love them both.
Exactly. So like, it's, again, and what I've liked about that is, like, I think there's like a collaborative kind of vibe within those communities. Like, hey, let's not make the same mistake before. Like, let's work together. We're in the same like fight here. The fight's not on Bitcoin side. It's like against broader crypto to make Bitcoin fun again, right? So like, I'm appreciating that. I think people are underestimating these things at large. And what I like about it is like there's just so many different types of implementations. Like, each has their novel, like whatever. And it's like bring us back like 2 years back to like when people were throwing shit at the wall, like with, using the ordinals envelope. It kind of reminds me a little bit to that. So I'm excited. I think, people are underestimating it at large. And then, specifically, like, I'll chill our bags a little bit with the programmable module. Like, I think people again are only looking one step ahead. Oh, you can deploy these contracts, like they're going to be MEV attacked. Like, oh, you like you're still confined to like the Bitcoin fees and block times, et cetera, not realizing that you can take things a step further and implement sequencer-led applications, right? So, I'm excited to see how that plays out. But obviously, you want to do it right, take your time, do testnet, et cetera, et cetera. And then that combined with like this single step transfer we're like toying around with, I think it would be like it's just like, I'm again optimistic.
You mentioned the single transfer several times. I didn't dive too deeply into it, but that is something that the market has clearly been asking for. Is that why you're so excited about it? Because this seems to be something that's being demanded by BRC20 users. Do you think that if you hadn't gotten those demands, you would care to implement it?
Yeah, I always like was a little hesitant about like the actual need for it. It always seemed to me as like a FUD point.
Fair. Ditto.
Because you could abstract it away on the wallet side, so it really like
Infra could have solved the problem.
Oh, it did solve the problem for
Right.
like a number of wallets, right? So I was always a bit like, okay, I get it. Like, if you didn't do this from day one, you probably would take a different approach. It was a function of just like putting this together quickly, but it worked.
And Runes is not that different. I mean, that was sort of a core takeaway of the BZ interview. BZ made that point very loud and clear.
And again, like, I don't really care to go like into that, but it's like, the real motivation and what I'm excited for here is like, okay, A, it makes the experience better. That's great. But two, like, it actually like allows you to plug into other systems much easier than before, right? Like, if you think about a bridge right now, like, you have to have that like threshold signing signatures, like, or sorry, threshold TSS system to inscribe then transfer, which is like quite complicated for the average, like when they're used to just releasing UTXOs like a normal bridge. This would approximate just like a simple, like a lockout of a bridge. And there's like some things we're also looking into, like even having lightning enablement, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's like like, and again, I don't want to make any promises. We've been guilty
but it's an interesting idea. I hadn't even really thought about.
Exactly. So like, it's another thing that I'm, optimistic at the moment.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Domo. This was super fun. I am very excited to have Benari on the show. And any kind of like final words about what you're most excited about related to like a post BRC 2.0 world?
Yeah, I mean, like I like, let's talk about Benari like coming on for a second. Like, I think I'm really lucky to be in a place where we have two like teams that are like as fired up for the future as I am, are as passionate and willing to put in the work, because people forget, like,
and talented,
I mean, of course, what we talk about. Like,
yeah.
So I'm excited to hear that show, but just excited in the general direction that we're going. Yeah. And thanks for having me, Isabel.
Thank you. Thank you, Domo.